Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast where we shine the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith, and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. On this week's podcast, we are going to continue our conversation about critical race theory, how to recognize it, and what you can do to confront this growing threat to our children, our families, our communities, and ultimately this country. Joining me today is PJTN's legal counsel, Mike Goldstein. To help inform our audience about this threat to our children and our republic, I have brought a professional who has been involved in fighting critical race theory for several years. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. I also want to remind you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Mike Goldstein. Mike, welcome to Proclaiming Justice. Thank you for taking time to be with us today to discuss this important issue.
Laurie, thank you. I'm honored to be on the podcast with you. There's a lot of important information that parents out there and grandparents of kids who are in our schools really want to know and need to know. And we can talk about that this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining this conversation with us because it is a critical issue for the future of our country. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear a lot of important information, and it's going to be information that you can use to educate and activate your community as well. So, Mike, as you know, this past week, I was in San Francisco meeting with parents and citizens who were involved in recalling 3 school board members on their school board. Now, these individuals were a diverse group of people. They were individuals of color, including Asian Americans, and your average Americans. They were men and women, people of faith, and people unaffiliated with a religion. They were parents and citizens. What united them was their patriotism and love of America and our Judeo-Christian values that ensured our freedoms. It is the mainstream media and the Marxists' worst nightmare come true. The unification of this community from divergent backgrounds destroys the Marxist agenda to divide us when this group was a microcosm of why America is unique and why our experiment as a country works. They were united against using technology in classrooms, against changing the names of schools in their districts, from patriots like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And they were also opposed to the discrimination against students based on the color of their skin. So the Marxists weren't prepared for this response from the community. Even the mayor was outraged by the behavior of those 3 Marxists, which leads me to our conversation with you today. The actions of this group reverberated across the United States, as you well know, and it sent a message loud and clear that whether you are conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, that community rose up and said, enough. It has inspired parents and citizens across the U.S. to unite together to take back local control of their children's education. And Mike, you recently wrote an important article about moving CRT or removing CRT in the classroom that appeared in the American Thinker. You mentioned in the article that state legislators are clueless about CRT and where it came from. So, Mike, before we start getting into the specifics, Give us a background, give our audience a background on where critical race theory came from.
Sure, Lori. One of the problems is that critical race theory in our schools, along with social and emotional learning and comprehensive sexual education in our schools, those are weapons. They are not the ultimate goal. They are weapons of the Marxists who are using our children to help them create a Marxist society in America. That's the goal. That's the goal. And parents are realizing that there's a problem with what their kids are learning, and they don't really know why this is being taught, and that's why it's being taught. Um, Critical race theory began as critical theory after the First World War, and it was in Frankfurt, Germany. There was a group of philosophers um, who were very, very leftist philosophers. They were Marxists, and they
Mhm.
created this critical theory to divide every society by class. Uh, Property owners versus non-property owners, industrialists versus
Mhm.
workers, and that's what they were trying to do. And it turns out that everything they have written, everything they wrote, has been completely opposite from what our United States Constitution says. And we need to keep that in mind because we're fighting that battle now. Now,
Mhm.
they were in Germany in the 1920s and in the 1930s. In the 1930s, the communists and the leftists, I'm sorry, the communists and the Nazis were fighting each other in the streets to see who would win over Germany. And of course, the Nazis won. And these philosophers of Marxism had to leave. They got out while they could, and they
Mhm.
relocated at Columbia Teachers College in New York. I know it's a little hard to believe, but that's where they
Mhm.
went. And they've been giving us and putting it into teachers' colleges,
Mhm.
teaching our the people who are now our teachers in our schools this Marxist theory. In the
Mhm.
1960s and 70s, it morphed into something called a critical legal theory, trying to find a legal basis um, for creating this division within our country. And finally, they gave up. They couldn't divide us by class because, as they said in their own writings, um, Americans and the Western societies in general are pretty happy with their, if you want to put it in quotation marks, class structure. They're
Mhm.
happy with their jobs. They're happy with their God. They're happy with,
Mhm.
they're happy with their society. So finally, they gave up on that and they decided there would have to be a different way they would divide us. And they decided to do that by race, and not
Mhm.
just by race. They thought there would have to be other um, groups that would be identified as the oppressed,
Mhm.
and they've done that now with race and gender, and
Mhm.
they've divided us up. This is what they're trying to do to foment a Marxist revolution here, and now they're
Mhm.
doing it for our children. It morphed later into critical race theory that we saw in the 1619 project from the New York Times.
Right.
um, you guys talked about that in an earlier podcast, I believe, didn't you, Lori?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I
Absolutely.
won't go into detail here, except to say that these people, they think differently from the rest of us. They don't believe in demonstrable facts. They don't believe in empiricism. They believe in
Mhm.
narratives and stories. So
Mhm.
when the scholarly historiography community, the people who write our academic history books, complained to the New York Times that their curriculum, which was picked up by the Pulitzer Foundation and distributed to thousands of classrooms in the United States, they were told, "Well, this isn't history; it's not true."
Mhm.
And the response of the editor of the article of the program was, "So what? Doesn't matter. Truth doesn't matter. We don't care. We're not. This is not supposed to be history. This is
Right.
supposed to be narrative. To change the narrative from America is a an exceptional society into America is a hateful society, and we want to
Mhm.
destroy the free enterprise system
Mhm.
and the family structure and the religious structure."
Mhm.
And they're looking for reparations for
Mhm.
slavery. The whole thrust of this is that um, the American Revolution was not a revolution to democratize, to separate us from England, from the oppression of England. It was really to protect the institution of slavery
Mhm.
within what is now the United
Mhm.
States.
Yep.
And to use the technical term, it's all baloney. But
Mhm.
this is what they're teaching our children. That's why
Mhm.
kids are coming home with these terrible assignments. This is why a little girl came home and recently and said to her mother, she was crying and crying. She says, "Why? They told me I'm a boy today. I don't want to be a boy
Mhm.
today." You know, and um,
Yeah, we're seeing similar situations occur too with kids are who come home and like biracial children and telling their parents they don't like the white side of them. This is what's being introduced to these kids, and we're also seeing it in math. As you know, we are in the process of reviewing math curriculum in Tennessee, and the math equity curriculum is also trying to brainwash the teachers now to teach about math equity, not to encourage children to come to the correct answer. It's grading them on their process, on the process of how they come to their answer, because it is racist to expect a child that may have a different color skin. Of course, this is all part of the critical race theory, but it's racist for the teacher to expect a child of color to come up with the right answer. That is racism. That's part of the whole agenda of critical race theory.
so it's not merely separating our children, making them hate each other and hate their parents and hate their religions. It's also taking the place of real education in our schools. They're
Mhm.
not teaching our kids reading and mathematics anymore. They're teaching them activism, and that you can see it because the schools are failing.
Mhm.
Failing. The kids are
Absolutely.
failing the standardized tests. So
Mhm.
this is what's going on.
And of course, they're failing the standardized test, but now the universities are talking about how they're not going to um, uh, use the ACT or the SAT to determine which children or students are going to be accepted into their universities because these kids are doing so poorly. And this is one of the things that this community in San Francisco is fighting against. It was just, like I said earlier, it's an amazing thing to watch Asian parents, parents of color, your average white Americans. I can't believe we're even having this conversation like this.
You
But
didn't
here,
emphasize this, Lori, in your initial statement, but you brought it up a little later, and it's extremely important that most of those people are not conservatives. Most of them are not Republicans. Most of them are Democrats.
that's exactly right.
I mean, that's the people who live there. And even they, I mean, that doesn't mean they're leftists necessarily, but they are liberals. And they still want to see that their kids get a good education and are not divided on the basis of the color of their skin.
Exactly, exactly. So, you mentioned in your article, Mike, about the state legislators and whether they are listening, whether they are taking action to remove or stop this divisive agenda from their classrooms. Let's talk a little bit about that. Where are the state legislators, and can you give us some examples of states that are taking on this issue to confront it?
Well, the state legislators are learning more and more about it. And we can talk about at the end, we'll talk about at the end of the podcast what the grassroots responsibility is in this case. Um, the state legislatures of all the 50 states still have power in this country. Congress is tied up in knots. They're doing bad stuff. They're not going to pass these things that are necessary to be passed. Some of the federal agencies under the last administration were doing some good work in this regard. That has changed now. We can't rely on the federal government to do any of this. It's up to the grassroots to work through their state legislators and legislatures,
Mm-hmm.
and and we'll talk in more detail through their own school boards. That's
Mm-hmm.
extremely important. This is where the grassroots will come in. But there are some state legislators who do understand or are beginning to understand. mostly because their constituents are contacting them and making them begin to understand.
Right.
But I was on a conference call with, there are several states who have passed legislation to bar the teaching of critical race theory to their children in their schools. But having reviewed the bills that states have passed in this regard, and some of the bills that other states have proposed and have not passed yet, one thing becomes painfully obvious right away. The bills are very, very weak.
Mm.
It's our position that there are two things that have to be in these bills to get critical race theory out of the schools. First, you've got to cut off all avenues of revenue for creating these programs in the schools and teaching them and having
Mhm.
teacher training in them. You've got to cut it all off. And what you see is this doesn't appear in very many bills. You've got to cut off all federal funding,
Mhm.
federal government, county government, state government. Um, in Ohio, where I used to live, the state board of education was giving grants to individual teachers in school districts to teach the 1619 project.
Oh my
So you've got to
gosh.
cut off intrastate funding of these things. So
Mhm.
first thing to do is close off all, and very importantly, you have to have your legislators include in their bills cutting off private funding.
Mhm. Mhm.
All the leftist organizations who are in favor of this, all the woke organizations that are private, non-governmental agencies,
Mhm.
in, organizations, NGOs, they're feeding money into these schools as well. You've got to cut
Mhm.
that off in legislation.
Absolutely. Mike, before you go on, I just want to park on this for just a second because, ladies and gentlemen, this is extremely important. This garbage would not be introduced in our schools if there wasn't funding to fuel this. And Mike is making a very important point. In fact, in Tennessee, the governor has a surplus of funding in the state this year, and he wants to take that surplus and apply it to education. And the unfortunate reality is, though, even though he's making these great, grandiose comments about how we have all this extra money, we're going to put it into education, we need to stop, ladies and gentlemen. We need to ask our government, our state government, where is the funding from education coming? In Tennessee, we know funding for education comes from the state or from the tax dollars, the people who pay property taxes. It comes from the federal government for those programs that the State Department of Education has adopted that came from the federal government. So there's funding that comes from the federal government. And then there's an other category in Tennessee. But that other category is not defined. However, we know that people like Bill Gates, who want to impact education and critical race theory and all of this Common Core garbage in our schools, he is a big contributor to education in Tennessee. We know that he's given at least $34 million. But this information, this is so critically important. We need, as Mike stated, we need to cut the funding from the federal government. Our departments of education in each of our states should be funded by themselves. We should not have big business coming in and funding our children's education because if big business is coming in with a check, then they're expecting a return on their investment. And that means it's going to be a program that you and I, ladies and gentlemen, are not necessarily going to agree with. That has to stop. We need more transparency in where those education dollars come from so that we can cut that, just like Mike was talking about. This is all about grassroots. We need to know where the funding is coming from so that we can speak with our legislators and let them know we want the funding to stop. Mike, continue. You were talking about the legislators.
You're right. And what we found from other states is what I had suspected. I was on a conference call with some of the legislators from other states. I was in Ohio at the time, that had passed bills, and the bills were very weak. Turns out the reason is what I expected to find. They had initially strong bills,
Mm-hmm.
but when they tried to get them passed, they found that there were other legislators who wouldn't sign on to them unless the effective stuff was taken out. That would be the funding, and the other area, which
Mhm.
is having penalties to disincentivize schools and teachers from actually teaching what the law says they're not allowed to teach. Because the
Mhm.
teachers union are telling them to teach it anyway. So you have to disincentivize them.
Mhm.
So, um, so, and there were governors who wouldn't pass bills that were effective. What we have is what is really the bane of America. It's virtue signaling. I passed a bill to stop critical race theory in the schools.
Right.
Well, you could drive a
Mhm.
truck through the holes in those bills. Okay. Um,
Mhm.
so, and this gets into how we are going to get this done. There is model language to have inserted into very strong bills, and we're trying to have that done in certain states. Um, and this is where the grassroots comes in. I had
Mhm.
another article in American Thinker that said this is where the veterans need to come in and fulfill their oaths of protecting the Constitution against all
Mhm.
enemies, foreign and domestic, because
Mhm.
critical race theory is a domestic enemy to the Constitution of the United States. It just
Exactly.
is. When you read what they write, and from the theorists, and you read the Constitution, we've all taken an oath. Anybody like me who's been in the military, and the legislators themselves take basically the same oath to protect and defend the Constitution. You got to
Mhm.
remind them of that. And
Mhm.
what we have to do with the grassroots is work in one of the two areas, which is finding out who your state representatives and your state senators are. Um, if you belong to any groups, conservative groups particularly, they could get this information from you, or you can just go on the state website and
Mhm.
state legislature's website. Make sure you know who your person is there, your representative, your senator,
Mhm.
um, and look at the people who are on the education committees, both elementary K through 12, whatever it's called there, and higher education. Get all their contact information,
Mhm.
because when bills come up, you need to contact um, your legislators, and you got to send them
Mhm.
emails, and you got to call on the telephone, and you can use snail mail. Believe me, they pay attention to what their constituents are saying. You
Yeah.
need to write to the committee members. You need to write particularly to your own people. And I do say this, and I really can't emphasize it strongly enough. If you go on the website of your state representative or your state senator, you're going to find the bills that they're interested in. Might have nothing to do with this.
Mhm.
But if you have an opinion about it, get into the habit of contacting them, sending them an email. I don't like what you're doing in this bill. I'm really happy that you're backing this other bill. So they get used to hearing from you. And then when it hits the fan in something like critical race theory, they're more likely to pay attention to what you write to them then. It's
Right.
it's a process. It's becoming political, and it's very
Mhm.
important. And the
Well,
other area, yeah, go ahead there, Lori.
well, I wanted to ask you about Florida, for example, because Governor DeSantis signed an executive order banning CRT from being taught in Florida's classrooms. And the teachers and administrators came out, some of them did, came out stating that they would teach CRT anyways, that they were going to defy the executive order. How can you enforce? How is it possible, as an attorney? How do we enforce this legislation or executive order when you have educators who refuse to uphold the executive order? And the other question I wanted to ask you, the difference between passing legislation and an executive order. It's my understanding that an executive order is will only last as long as, the governor who's in office, and the next governor who comes in, the next administration could undo every executive order that the governor had signed into law.
Well, that's true. An executive order doesn't have to be changed by the next governor, but chances are the important ones will be. And it works in both ways. In Virginia, they finally elected a Republican governor who banned critical race theory in his executive order. But
Mm-hmm.
they can change, and whatever you do in an executive order is sort of like soft money, grant money to a professor. You can keep teaching this as long as the grants keep coming in, but if the grants stop, your
Mm-hmm.
teaching stops. So that's just an analogy here. Um,
Right.
it's a very good thing to. This is why it's so important to pass a bill. When you
Mm-hmm.
have a bill that's in law, Well, the next governor can't throw it out. The next governor is going to have to promote legislation to get it out. And if he doesn't have the state legislature behind him or her on that issue, can't get it done. And that's
Right.
why it's important for your state, wherever you are, to pass legislation like this.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
we at PJTN can help you, give you model language, and work with your own legislators, um, and with departments of education if they want to. I've been
Mm-hmm.
contacted by one of the state departments of education, the state superintendent, who wants
Mm-hmm.
to work on this stuff. So it's important. But the other issue, Laurie, if it's time to get into that, is what the grassroots can and must do at the local level.
Absolutely. That's going to be my next question. How do we mobilize to defeat critical race theory? And we know that it does require citizen engagement. So let's talk a little bit about that, Mike.
Sure. Um, this is how parents get involved in the first place, how they got involved in San Francisco. They realized that their kids are learning garbage in school, stuff that's against, they're coming home, and they don't like their religion anymore. I mean, it's silly. So parents, and especially during COVID, when kids were doing distance learning, and parents who cared could watch what their kids were learning on their own computers, and they became very agitated about it. And in fact,
Mm.
some school districts send notes home that parents are not allowed to watch what their kids are learning on
That's
their own
right.
computers. They
It's hard
wanted
to
parents
even
to sign a
believe that.
pledge not to
Yeah,
watch. Well, that's stupid. And that's why the debate over, we're our kids. They shut down the schools. We got our kids back to school. We got to get our kids back into school. And I'm thinking, why?
Mhm.
Until you
Ex-
fix the schools, they're going to go back and learn terrible, terrible stuff that's going to turn them against you.
That's
So,
exactly
okay,
right.
parents are employed and they need to work, and I understand all this.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so what parents need to do is, I've met parents here. I'm living in a different state now. I'm in Arizona. I've met very parents who are very politically active in all sorts of things with their own political parties, but they realize something's going on with the kids and they don't know what to do about it because they've never been involved in that.
Right.
Um, so what it takes is you've got to collect data. What are the kids in your school district learning? What are the assignments they're getting? Especially if you have written assignments or stuff you can take screenshots of,
Hmm.
stuff your kids bring home or your grandparents bring home. Believe me, the grandparents can be very effective here. Um, so you collect this data, and then what do you do with it? Well, you want to see what the curriculum is that your kids are learning. So an individual parent tries to find that out, and in most cases, even where there's a law saying they're entitled to see it, they get they get stonewalled by the
Hmm.
teacher, by the principal, by the superintendent, by the board of education. The solution, well, there are a lot of interim solutions that we can
Hmm.
teach to you. We can teach to parent groups, and we do, um, when they come to us. And I'm starting to talk to parent groups here in Arizona about it. But you have to get into this for the long haul, and it's a real slog. In the Scottsdale, Arizona Unified School District, this was something that was picked up on Fox Business. The superintendent, no, yeah, no, not the superintendent, the president of the Board of Education. The board was getting a lot of parents coming into school board meetings and complaining about what their kids were learning in school. And
Hmm.
the president of the Board of Education started doing opposition research and keeping dossiers on the parents who were coming in and complaining.
Yeah.
Their divorce records, whether they've been sued for anything, stuff that you'd see in a political battle with candidates at the presidential level.
Hmm.
And the parents thought that if they made enough noise, they could get him to resign. Well, they did, and he resigned, but he didn't resign from the board. He resigned from the presidency of the board, and he just changed seats with the former vice chairman, president of the board, who had the same political attitudes, and he
Mm.
remained on the board. So the parents tried to recall. Many states do not have a statute allowing citizens to do petitions and recall their local school board members. Arizona does have
Right.
one of those, but it's very hard. They found that when you compute out how it has to be done, the parents needed to get 25,000 signatures approximately for each of the school board members they wanted recalled, and they couldn't get it done. And I wrote an article in PJTN, which appears on our website and in the Arizona page, which says, more power to you if you can get this recall done. But remember, if you can't, what you have to do is organize and run campaigns and replace those school board members with school board members who have the point of view that education in this country needs to be reading, writing, and arithmetic, and art and science, and not
Hmm.
critical race theory, and not diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's not what you want for your kids. So
Exactly.
what that takes is 2 election cycles if you can get them elected. So you'll have a majority of 3 people to 2 people on your board that can get some things done and get the
Hmm.
get the thing changed. Now, other people are saying, people we know and people we like are saying it's too late. We can't fix our schools. Get your kids out if you can and homeschool them or get them into proper charter schools that are not following this
Hmm.
drivel. Some people can do that, others can't. And I I am of the opinion that if the grassroots gets involved, we can get this done. We can make it better, especially
Absolutely.
if we have school choice where the money follows the student. That's very
Hmm.
important to break the power of the union and make
Hmm.
their own schools, public schools, competitive again, like we
Hmm.
had when we grew up, to make them better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a movement for that across the country. It's becoming more and more popular. And ladies and gentlemen, Mike is making a very important point that the way we're going to change our country is if we, the people, launch grassroots campaigns in our counties by taking on our school districts, county by county, state by state. It is the way we take back America. And I so appreciate Mike's feedback, the input. I love the idea, Mike, about our veterans because our veterans also play an important role in this whole battle because they too swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. And so it's critically important, even those veterans that are out there listening to this show, you too have a role to play. I want to just include another group of individuals within our community. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have not reached out to your sheriff in your county, I want to encourage you to reach out to him. Our sheriffs are elected and they are required to uphold the Constitution and our constitutional rights within our county. We should, when we go to these school board meetings, you should have a relationship with your sheriff that you could call him and ask him to assign a deputy to attend the meeting because parents, their rights are being squashed in these meetings. Some parents, they're being cut off at the podium. Their video is being cut off. Their audio is being cut off. They won't let the parents testify. They try to limit the number of people that can actually come and speak during an open hearing. This is unacceptable, and you need somebody to be your advocate in those school board meetings. So don't forget your local sheriff.
I'd like to make one other point, Lori. We're conservatives are not elitists. What I don't want to see, what we don't want to see, is this country more divided than it needs to be. Yes, we should be homeschooling kids. Yes, they should be in charter schools. But we have a responsibility as Americans to fix the public schools. Otherwise,
Yes.
we're leaving the rest of the children who are stuck there to their fate. And they deserve better schools too. So we
That's
need to keep
exactly right.
fighting for that, even as we are homeschooling some of our own kids.
Good point. Good point, Mike. Mike, as we're wrapping up the coming to a close of the program, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners, our audience, to encourage and inspire them?
Yes. Um, if you have 6 or 8 parents who are really upset about this, and that might even include some teachers who are very brave, and maybe even a school board member or two. And if you can put together a parlor meeting
Mhm.
of parents who want to learn how to oppose their local school boards, or parents who want to know how to talk to their state legislators, we'd be willing to help you do that. And maybe we can even do it sometimes virtually. But if it's in an area where we have somebody from PJTN who can come and talk to you, or using local resources, we will do that, because you need to know how to work against your school board effectively. And small groups of parents are at the bedrock of this. So
Mhm.
please reach out to PJTN if you want to learn how to get this done, and we will
Mhm.
help.
Absolutely. Mike, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, you heard it from our legal counsel. I want to encourage you to go to our website to learn more about how to take back local control of your children's education. Ultimately, as Mike said, it starts with you. It's grassroots. If you are interested in hosting a summit in your community to help educate, motivate, and activate your county to flip your school board, now is the time to do it. This is an election year, and now is the time to act. I hope you enjoyed this program. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly rising Marxist threat that is destroying this nation and threatening our Judeo-Christian values. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman, and the watchman's role is to warn the inhabitants of the city. But if the watchman fails to warn the inhabitants and any innocent die because of it, it will be required, that death will be required of the watchman. However, if the watchman warns the inhabitants of the city of the threat that is coming, and the people refuse to listen and heed the advice or the wisdom of the watchman, and they die, it will be required of them. It will not be required of the watchman, because we have done our job. And as watchmen, you, ladies and gentlemen, can sound the alarm and warn others by simply sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Please share and like it to help us sound the alarm in your county. I want to remind you, Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminded us that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. At the signing of our Declaration of Independence, our founders knew they were handed a sure death sentence for signing the revolutionary document. Yet they still recognized their firm reliance on the protection of divine providence and mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We, the people, must resolve today to do nothing less. If we are to defeat this enemy, we must get engaged in the battle. In closing, don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism, taking back local control of our communities and our children's education by combating CRT. I also want to just to remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this effort and more programs like this for just $20 a month. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. I want to leave you with the sobering statement by Abraham Lincoln when he said, "The philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next." God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.